conference will be with Shailey Hingorani. She is the Head of Advocacy and Research at AWARE, Association of Women for Action and Research. As I've mentioned to you, when we think about 2050, we have to think about it in a very different ways. Before joining AWARE, Shailey worked on women's rights and child rights in Southeast Asia and the United States. She has worked with the Open Society Foundations, the FXB, our Harvard Centers for Health and Human Rights, the Indian missions to the United Nations, Save the Children, and the Bloomberg Initiative. Shailey was a Fulbright scholar at Harvard University, and she received a master's in public administration. Please welcome Shailey.
This is fine. Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is my first time wearing a face shield. Everything is a little blurry. So if you see me looking around a little strangely, you know why that is. So this is another first for me. Usually when I'm invited to talk to students, I don't have to include a slide on who I am. But I suppose this is a business school ritual, is it?
Yeah. Do you prefer to use this one to be there, or?
Whatever you prefer. I'm happy.
I guess it will be better if you hold it.
Okay. There are a number of things to hold. Okay, so I'm actually going to skip over the first slide. Of course, if you have any questions about my career, doing a master's in public administration, feel free to raise those questions at the end. What I'm going to start with is a brief introduction of AWARE, the organization that I work with. Xavier mentioned that I'm the Head of Advocacy and Research there. Now, AWARE has a really interesting origin story. I know that we typically use the term origin story when talking about superheroes, and that's how I tend to think of AWARE. It is Singapore's one of the oldest civil society organizations. We're a feminist organization, we're a women's rights organization. The reason I want to spend some time on the origin story is because the origin story really speaks to our principles that have continued to guide us. They guide us even today in terms of the work that we do, the research that we do, the advocacy that we do. Now, AWARE was founded in 1985 in response to a policy called the Graduate Mothers Scheme. After the 1980 census, the state in Singapore actually became particularly concerned that better educated women were reproducing at lower rates than less educated women. And that graduate women in particular were remaining single. They were worried that the following generation might be, quote, depleted of talent, unquote. The state believed that better educated parents would produce more intelligent, talented offspring, and that it was important to ensure that graduate women had more children. These comments, as you can expect, drew several accusations of elitism. Still, the state introduced a slew of policies the following year. First, to encourage graduate women to marry and have more children. It established what was then called the Social Development Unit in 1984 to encourage matches, and I'm serious about this, to encourage matches between graduate women and men in the public services. Under the new Graduate Mothers Priority Scheme, Now, under this new Graduate Mothers Priority Scheme, children of graduate mothers with at least 3 children would receive top priority in Primary 1 registration in the school of their choice. These policies obviously angered many citizens. Even graduates felt that it was a little unfair. And this scheme is what led to the organization of a landmark forum called Women's Choices, Women's Lives in 1984 that subsequently led to the formation of AWARE, whose first position paper, interestingly, was on the issue of population policies. As you can hopefully surmise from our origin story, our feminism was intersectional from the very beginning. We were concerned not only about the social engineering inherent in these policies, but also concerned about class-based discrimination. Intersectional feminism, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, but very simply, intersectional feminism is the idea that not all inequality is created equal. And this continues to guide our work, as I said earlier. This is important, and please pay attention to this. This is important because we often tend to talk about, for example, racial inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, as separate from inequality based on sexual orientation, class, even immigrant status. What's often missing from these conversations is how people are often subject to all these inequalities. And the experience is not just the sum of its parts. Now, our work over the years has yielded many important structural changes, policy changes, including the introduction of the Women's Charter, the lifting of the female quota of medical students, the introduction of POHA, or the Protection from Harassment Act, and most recently we won several important victories on providing single parents with access to housing. In fact, when you meet with Louis Ng later this week, you should ask him about working with AWARE. He was one of our parliamentary champions, and in fact filed a petition on behalf of single parents. At AWARE, so what does AWARE do as an organization? We combine trainings with services, with research and advocacy. And this combination makes us a fairly unique organization because most other organizations in Singapore are focused on services. Not many of them combine services with research and advocacy. We run a women's helpline. We've run it since the early 90s. And we also run Singapore's only sexual assault care center. Our corporate training arm, called Catalyze Consulting, provides trainings to corporates on how to manage workplace harassment and how to ensure that companies are diverse in their hiring and other employment practices. Just give me a second, I feel like this is, okay. So I am going to assume that many of you decided to study this year in 2021, the year following one of the most tumultuous years sort of known to us in the recent past, because you want to change how businesses and workplaces respond to meet environmental and social challenges. And what I'm going to do today, do you mind if I wear my mask instead? This feels like it's slipping off. That's much better. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to talk to you about 3 social challenges today. And you can see these on your screen. The first one is workplace inequality. The second one is work-care conflict. And the third one is workplace sexual harassment. You'll notice that all these are obviously workplace related. Now, this is because the workplace, and this is something that I fundamentally believe in, and it can be, when I say workplace, it can be a factory, it can be a farm, it can be an office, it could even be the street. It's a strategic entry point. Workplaces are strategic entry points to an equal society. Now, like any other social institutions, the labor market and its institutions are both a cause as well as a solution to inequality. In the workplace, however, inequality can be addressed more readily, more effectively, more comprehensively. Our way of life, which I believe is the theme of this year's orientation, must put at its heart issues of inequality, of social justice, and human dignity. For each workplace issue that I'll talk about, I'll start off by showing you a little video, because I don't like the sound of my own voice. And I hope this video will catalyze some amount of in-room discussion. I'll follow this up with a description of what that particular workplace inequality or discrimination looks like in the context of Singapore. And finally, I'll talk about both policy as well as company approaches to addressing these workplace issues and why I think these fall short. Let's start with workplace inequality. I will now play you a video we produced when we launched a new service at Aware. The service is called Workplace Harassment and Discrimination Advisory, which hopefully, as the name suggests, is a service that provides practical advice as well as emotional support to clients experiencing discrimination and harassment. Since its launch in September 2019, we have seen over 200 cases of workplace harassment and discrimination. Yes, please, thank you. Oh, okay. So this can't play? Yeah, we will skip this. Oh, okay. Got it. Okay. So I guess we'll watch this in a few moments. I'm going to skip ahead to what workplace inequality and discrimination actually looks like. So a 2020 report by the Ministry of Manpower, which is the local Ministry of Labor, revealed that 60% more employees were investigated for discriminatory practices, hiring practices, in the first half of 2020 than in the same period last year. This number is hardly surprising to us because since the launch of WHDA, the service that I just mentioned, Workplace Harassment and Discrimination Advisory, 34% of all our calls and cases have pertained to discriminatory practices. And these involve both job applicants as well as employees. The thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that the MOM data that I shared with you earlier is restricted to employees, whereas the kinds of calls and cases we receive include both job applicants as well as employees. Now, 71% of these discriminatory practices calls that we receive come from employees who are facing pregnancy discrimination. And other types of discrimination that we've often seen involve the interaction between race and gender and family and caregiving responsibilities. Now, I think it's really important to remember that discrimination, especially when you think about workplace-related discrimination, can manifest at any stage of employment. It could manifest at the hiring stage. It could manifest at the stage when managers are deciding who to promote. It could even manifest at the stage where managers are deciding who to give certain perks to, including elder care leave, child care leave, flexible work care arrangements, and so on and so forth. The second indicator that I want to talk to you about is women in leadership. Now, how much of a problem is women in leadership? And is it the same? Is the problem the same across different types of companies? The representation of women in boards of top 100 listed companies in Singapore was about 16% in 2018 to 2019. It's 25% board representation of women on statutory boards, and about 27%, and this always really surprises me, 27% for boards of charity organizations. You would imagine that charity organizations are more progressive. They pay more attention to gender diversity, but their numbers don't actually support that proposition. The problem is actually even worse for startup businesses. Now, this is based on data that I have from the US, but I don't see any reason why startups in Singapore, boards of startups in Singapore, would be any different. So this one study that I looked at found that of startup boards, women in 2019 held just over 7% of the board seats. And perhaps, even more strikingly, 60% of the 1,000 startup boards this study looked at did not have a single female board member. Some obviously will see these numbers and immediately think there is a problem, that we should have more women on boards. One way to look at it, obviously, is to look around and see how many women you have in an MBA class, right? And try and figure out what happens to women between the period where they're students, they're MBA students, and a couple of decades later, when their male classmates are CEOs, are on boards. Where do women go? Where do women go? Any ideas? Come on, it's not that. Yes, go ahead.
Further down in the ladder of businesses because they don't have the same opportunities as men to go up the ladder in those big businesses.
And why would that be? Why would they not have the same opportunities when they're starting out as equals? Yes. Yes, at the back. Yes, that's exactly it. Parenting and other family care obligations, right? In a country like Singapore, you will add elder care responsibilities to the mix as well. Because in Singapore, the fertility rate is actually pretty low. It's below replacement, but it's rapidly aging. So much so that 1 in 4 people, Singaporeans, will be over the age of 65 by 2030. Now, why is it that it is considered to be the woman's responsibility to provide care for kids and to take care of old, aging parents? Another way to think about this is to think about the households that you grew up in. Think about who performed most of the housework. Think about who performed most of the childcare. Not every one of us had the benefit of growing up in a household where there was help available easily. Does anyone want to share with us whether it was their mothers or fathers who did the lion's share of household work? Yes, please.
It's all about tradition, cultures, but I feel like that also the pay gap plays a huge role here. So the husband usually earns way more money, and therefore he keeps working in his business, whereas the wife stays home.
Yeah, that's a great response. That's a great response. So there's definitely a link with the gender pay gap, and this is obviously something that I want to come back to. There has been a number of studies done in the context of COVID-19, right, and unemployment due to COVID-19, and who gets to keep their jobs, especially if they have young children at home, and who gets to give it up, right? And there's a really interesting study done in the context of the US that finds that even when you have an unemployed husband and a working mother, and the family is sort of trying to decide whose career is more important, you automatically value the man's career more. He's unemployed at the moment, but there's something, I mean, people will say there's something natural about wanting to make sure that men can continue to be the breadwinners, and that's what Felix was suggesting, right? We all operate on the basis of these traditional gender roles that demand that men continue to behave as breadwinners and women continue to provide care. And this is going to be my second sort of big issue, work-care conflict, because workplaces, when they were first designed, were not designed for working caregivers. You don't find the kind of flexibility in workplaces that will allow women to juggle work and caregiving responsibilities at the same time. And that's a huge problem. That's why you see a number of women having to withdraw from the labor force, whether partially or fully. You see a lot of women taking early retirement, for instance. And all these labor-related decisions have cumulative effects, right? And therefore, it's hardly surprising that if you were to look at retirement savings of men and women in Singapore, there's a gap. There's an 11% gap. And given that women live longer than men, so in the context of Singapore, women are expected to live to be 85, as opposed to men who live to the age of 81. The lower retirement savings have to be stretched out for a longer period of time. Okay. Let's talk about gender pay gap, which is another issue that Felix brought up. Now, in 2018, women in Singapore earned 6% less than their male peers. This is payment for equal work. And this actually roughly translates to women making about $342 less in median monthly salary than men who were in similar job roles. Now, the 6% is what we call the adjusted gender pay gap, or the wage difference that remains after you control for factors such as the worker's industry, occupation, age, as well as education. However, when you just compare the median pay between both genders, and I'm talking about Singapore, the difference is 16.3% less than men. And this is data from 2018. Now, this 16.3% is what we call an adjusted gender pay gap because it's actually not controlling for the 4 factors that I listed out earlier. But we think that this is a better figure to look at because it takes into account the sacrifices that women have had to make because of motherhood, because of caregiving responsibilities. The 16.3% gap is actually largely driven by the tendency for men and women to work in different occupations. You see this in Singapore, you see this in a number of other countries as well. Women tend to be overrepresented in lower paying jobs compared to men. Men continue to be overrepresented in higher paying occupations. Often when I share this data with people such as yourselves, I always get a couple of skeptical questions from the audience. The skeptical questions usually go something like this. Well, women are just choosing to work in lower paying jobs. Is that true? I want to ask the women in the room, are we so stupid that we are deliberately choosing lower paying jobs? Or are these the only jobs that are available for women? Or is it the case that the work that women do is naturally devalued? a study in the US actually found that women are not deliberately choosing low-paying jobs, but the jobs they are doing are valued less than jobs that men do. Let me read out some empirical evidence for you. Empirical evidence shows that when a large number of women became designers, talking about fashion designers in the US, wages, occupation-wide, fell by 34%. When women became biologists, wages fell by 18%. And that's what I really want you to take away from this particular talk. That there are structural conditions that are influencing the kinds of labor decisions men and women make. The decisions that women are being forced to make, these are not choices women are making, but the decisions women are being forced to make have serious consequences, not only in terms of the income they're making today, but on their retirement savings many decades later. I don't know if the video is up or if I should go on. Yes?
Shailey, we don't have access to your video embedded. So we requested access. If you check your email, it's open. If it's on YouTube, I can't find it for you on YouTube.
Oh,
So we cannot access your file.
oh. I thought they checked it this morning, but let me.
Do you have them on YouTube? Can I find them for you on YouTube?
I don't think they're on YouTube.
So we sent requests to access.
Yeah, I've asked my colleague to give you
Thank
access.
you.
Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide in that case. So what we recommend. Obviously, workplace inequality doesn't exist in a vacuum. We know that inequality is shaped by societal norms, by our policy landscape, and measures that companies take or do not take in addressing workplace inequality. Now, before I turn to what we, i.e. Aware, think should be done to address workplace inequality, let me quickly acknowledge that the Singaporean government has actually made many great strides in increasing awareness of certain workplace inequality issues. A quick example of this, and there are many others, is the gender pay gap paper that the Ministry of Manpower released in January of 2020. This was the first ever such paper. Now, Singapore doesn't have an anti-discrimination legislation. What we have instead is maternity protection, which is guaranteed under the Employment Act. We have age-related discrimination, so we have protection against age-related discrimination, which is guaranteed under another piece of legislation. But there's no one singular anti-discrimination legislation. For all other categories, apart from maternity and age, that should be protected against discrimination. So thinking about race, thinking about sexual orientation, gender identity, Singapore has guidelines, it has advisories, it has standards. But these guidelines, advisories, and standards don't have the force of law behind them because they're suggestions that the government makes to companies in Singapore. So if you were to look at guidelines in the context of Singapore are typically defined as supplementing local law, whereas advisories are meant to outline progressive workplace practices that the government hopes employers are going to adopt. So instead of an anti-discrimination legislation with the full force of law behind it, what we have instead are tripartite guidelines on fair employment practices. And they're tripartite because a working group comprising of the government employers and the labor union basically came together to decide on these guidelines. On gender pay gap, Singapore does not have equal pay legislation or the requirement that companies of a certain size declare how much they pay men and women overall and for doing the same kind of job. Now, this is fairly recent, this legislative approach on gender pay gap, the requirement that companies of a particular size, so in the context of UK, it is companies that employ more than 250 employees have to declare how much they pay male and female employees at the same level for performing the same job, but overall as well. Let's have a little discussion here. Can anybody tell me why it's important to declare gender pay gap information?
Welcome to Zoom. Please press pound, then enter your meeting ID, followed by the pound sign again.
Anyone? Yes.
So that employees before starting to work for a company, so that before starting to work for a company, employees can decide whether they want to work for that company or not, for example.
Yes, absolutely. And secrecy often works to maintain the gender pay gap, right? Unless you have information that you're not being paid at the same rate as a male colleague, how are you going to fight for equal pay, right? Any other reasons why it's important to declare this information?
Welcome to Zoom.
Okay, if you don't want to respond to that question, here's another question. Xavier mentioned that there are people from 10 different nationalities in this class. We've talked about the UK. I've told you a little bit about Singapore. Can somebody from countries other than Singapore and UK tell us what their countries are doing about gender pay gap? Yes.
I think that companies in France have to declare the different salaries, the thing that you just said, the second point.
Right.
And there's a maternity leave obligation for companies to not promote men during the maternity leave of their colleagues. I think that's one of the many things that France does.
Fantastic. Any other examples? Yes.
You have the mic there.
Yeah, in India also, I think it's mostly like companies which are big organizations. They are obligated to maintain this information. But with smaller and medium-sized organization, usually the women rights organizations are the ones which are taking care of this information and not the companies themselves.
Right. Absolutely. Now, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk to you about something called blind recruitment. How many of us are familiar with blind recruitment? Just a show of hands.
Perhaps ask again the question.
Blind recruitment is a policy that I want to talk a little bit about at the end of my presentation, but it's relevant to the discussion that we're having on gender pay gap, so I'm bringing it up now. I want to know how many people in this room and the other one know what blind recruitment is. What kind of information do you typically include in your CVs, on your resumes when you're applying for jobs? Information that is not directly relevant to the job that you're applying for. Yes?
Your gender as well, your name, which obviously sometimes says a lot about the gender. And thus, the company can have already a first-hand view of who you are as a person and can make already a sort of first choice even before seeing you in real life and before judging your competencies. I know, for example, in the UK, now you're not allowed to put a profile picture so as to sort of stop this thing.
Excellent, yeah, that's exactly it. So blind recruitment is actually getting rid of all that information from your CVs so that employers are not consciously or unconsciously relying on metrics that have nothing to do with the job that you have applied for in assessing whether or not to hire you. Now, of course, when we've made this recommendation, a number of companies have told us that implementing this recommendation is extremely labor intensive, that they would have to hire a new person to redact the gender, the photograph, other sort of identifying details from each and every application. And that small companies are often not in a position to hire a person exclusively for this purpose. But thankfully, there are a number of online resources available, so you can upload CVs of job applicants on these platforms that will redact the information that you want redacted, and give you a serial number attached to every single job application. That's important. Equally, it's important that companies, when they interview you, don't ask you how much money you made at your last job. This is a frequent question, right, that we often have to respond to. The job ad will not tell you how much the job has been costed for by the company, right? You'll go in for your interview, you'll be asked, what was your last drawn? Because the employer is trying to anchor you to the money that you made in your last job. This is particularly harmful for women who've taken breaks, women who've had to step out of the labor force because of caregiving responsibilities, because of motherhood, because their last drawn salary is the salary they drew before they went on maternity leave. So whereas their colleagues have gained experience in the meanwhile, they have been outside the labor force. They have lost their network. And we all know how important it is to have an employment-related business network to succeed in today's world. This is exactly why we encourage companies to cost the job and not the person. Okay. I should perhaps spend some time talking about gender quota for leadership positions. This tends to be a fairly divisive issue. In Singapore, we don't have a hard gender quota. What we have instead are targets that have been set by the Council for Board Diversity. All listed companies are meant to achieve goals of 25% of every board being women by end 2025, 30% by end 2030, so on and so forth. They had a 20% target for 2020, which we haven't achieved. Now, going back to the startups I mentioned, remember I said that 60% of startup boards in the US don't have a single female member. If we were to introduce a female board member on each one of these startup boards, do you think that's going to make a difference? So you're going to go from an all-male board to a board that is overwhelmingly male, but has one female member. Anyone? Is there a way to get questions from the other room? No?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a WhatsApp online if they have any.
Okay. Well, you let me know. Yes?
Oh yeah, you need to use the mic. Just here, maybe. Yeah, for online students, use the mic. Just ask for.
I think it's definitely not enough, but it's just enough to change the mindset, and just shifting into all male board members to something that is more inclusive for women is something that has to begin somewhere. So for me, it makes a difference.
Great. Yes, it definitely makes a difference. But you know what the research shows on this? That you need to have a critical mass of women on any board to make a difference, so that women don't feel isolated. When they look around to the board, they see other people like them. It's also important that they don't become a token for the gender they represent. And that critical mass, research shows, is actually achieved at 30%. 30%, and that should be the aim. Of course, we should aim for 50%. But at the very least, if as a company, you want to benefit from the gains that diversity on the board, diversity in senior management gives you, you need to have a critical mass of 30% female employees or board members. You had a question?
Yes, I get the point, but isn't it just positive discrimination? I mean, you replace a problem by another one. I think it's not a solution in itself to just say, okay, we force a quota to have more women in a higher position, because even for the woman, she will feel like she doesn't deserve it. She will feel like she's here because of the quota, not because of her competencies or because she did well on her past project or whatever. And I was wondering, what do you think about this?
Is there anyone in the room who would like to respond to that? Come on, let's get a discussion going. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, but I think it has to start by this. So maybe the first woman who will get into the high function, maybe they will feel like they don't really deserve it, but it will give ideas to other women in the company, and then it will become quite normal. So I think if you want to resolve the problem, you have to start by that kind of quotas and stuff like this.
Yes, that's exactly it. So I'm in this school of thought, and we didn't say the quota has to be indefinite. You could have the quota for a couple of rounds, right? So it's not going to be a lifetime appointment. It's going to be, I mean, if your board has a tenure of 2 years, then you have a quota for 4 years, for 2 tenures, right? And it might be important because people who haven't worked with women before may have preconceived notions of how women might behave on boards. And it's important to have these preconceived notions challenged. And obviously one way to do that is by bringing people face to face, on the same board, in the same room. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
It's not a question, but just to tell more about what Theo said. So if we employ, let's say, women with a quota, will it change the situation? Because I think in the film, maybe the other will tell okay, these female are employed for quotas, and they won't maybe not consider the female. So the female position. So is it really change the situation actually to employ those female position with the quota?
Right. That's a great question. But my question to you is why we don't ask the same question when we're talking about overrepresentation of men on boards, right? Or why we don't ask the same question when we know that men are getting paid more to do the same job as women, right? Why does this question only arise when we're talking about placing women in certain positions? Why don't we problematize the fact that even though women make 50% of the population, they do not make 50% of senior management. They do not make 50% of board membership. So that's something to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a question from the other room. with regard to maternity leave, how could we change this discrimination, which often considerably slows down a woman's career development?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow, all of you are coming up with great questions. Maternity leave. So, many countries offer maternity leave. They also offer paternity leave. They offer a part of this leave as leave that can be shared between the mother and father. In Singapore, if you've given birth to a Singaporean child, you get 16 weeks as the mother of the child. The father gets about 4 weeks, I want to say. No, 2 weeks. 2 weeks or 4 weeks, I'm forgetting. And the 4 week, and another sort of 4 weeks of the 16 weeks the mother gets can be used up by the father. Let me recap that because I don't think I was particularly clear. If you've given birth to a Singaporean child, you get 16 weeks as the mother. As the father, you get between 2 to 4 weeks. I'm not exactly sure, but it's somewhere there. Out of the 16 weeks the mother gets, the father can share up to 4 weeks. Unsurprisingly, the rate of utilization of paternity leave in Singapore is really, really low. Men do not use their paternity leave. Now, one way to respond to the question that we have from the other room is to encourage more men to use paternity leave. And this is not just for the sake of the gender pay gap or female labor force participation, but there are a number of studies that actually show that kids benefit when their fathers spend more time with them, and especially in early childhood. So you're not just doing it to help out your female partners, you're also doing it because it has consequences for the way your child develops. Now, looking at parental leave policies, there are a couple of different features that make a difference. One is the kind of income replacement it offers. When you're going on leave, is your employer offering you 50% income replacement, 70%, or 100%? In the case of Singapore, it's actually 100%, which is why it's really surprising that men will not and do not use their paternity leave. You're getting 100% of your income to spend time with your newborn child at home, and you're not using it. On one of the earlier slides, you may have noticed the words motherhood penalty. In the context of Singapore, again, this is true definitely of the US, but also a number of Scandinavian countries, that women's wages drop after they have kids, but men's wages actually increase. Because we somehow have this perception that women, their attention at work is going to be divided because they have a child at home. But in the case of men, we think they're more committed at work when they have a child because they now have a family to provide for. I don't know if that sort of responds to that question. Yes?
I have a question regarding maternity leave and the gender pay gap. Is that I think firms often see, I guess, the financial risk as an argument to pay women less. How do you think that gap could be offset? Should the government offer a subsidy? Should maybe, the government pay the gap? Because obviously the firms, there is an understandable, I guess, argument on that side that firms are, I wouldn't say suffering, but have to offset that gap by employing another person while still paying the woman that is on maternity leave. So how should governments or firms react and provide solutions for this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We often talk to companies who say that not only women are more expensive as employees, right, because they often have to pay their maternity leave, but also the point that I made about commitment, that they're not as committed to work. And of course, there is, you know, the fact that you have to sometimes hire a maternity cover. There's also, we had a company once that told us that they did not want to offer maternity leave to a person because other employees, the pregnant woman's colleagues, would be very upset with her for having to do her work for the 4 months that she was going to be on leave. How do you deal with these issues? Any ideas? Should the government have a role to play? Let me tell you what the situation is in Singapore. So in Singapore, 50% of the leave is paid for by the government. Now you could say that's because Singapore, as a country, wants to ensure that men and women actually have kids because the country has such a low fertility rate, right? But what about countries where the fertility rate is not low? Should the government subsidize maternity leave, or should it be up to the employers to offer financial support, maternity leave? Any thoughts? Yes.
I guess it can't really be, well, it has to be a bit of the firm's role, but in the economic sense, it wouldn't be, because there would be a risk that then the employer would never hire a woman because of that risk. So in that sense, maybe it's the government's role, for its societal role as the head of state, to provide for that subsidy in order to make a more cohesive society, I would say.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we often forget that reproduction, social reproduction, is actually really important for societies, and especially aging societies like Singapore, right, where the dependency ratio, which is the number of working people in their prime working age, to the number of people who are not working, who are outside the labor force. Because it is these working people who are providing money through taxation that can help programs for older persons. Any other ideas? I haven't heard from this side of the room. Anyone in this section? It doesn't have to be about maternity. It could be about anything that we've discussed so far. Okay, let me move on, but for the next section, I'm going to come to this side of the room first. Maybe Charles can move to this section. I'm conscious of time. I had promised that I would talk to you about 3 issues, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip unpaid family caregiving because we've spent some time talking about maternity. The only other point I wanted to make in this context was that often when we think about caregiving, we only think about motherhood, right? We don't think about the unpaid family caregiving that we provide to older parents. And this is especially a reality in Singapore. It's also a reality in a number of other Asian countries that are rapidly aging. And yet, there seems to be a difference in how workplaces treat mothers and how they treat caregivers of older persons. So to give you an example, employers in Singapore offer paid childcare leave. They do not offer paid elder care leave. So if you're a caregiver who's providing care to a young child, you can take time off, 6 days a year. If you're caring for an older person, your parent-in-law, you do not get any paid leave. Why is that? Why is caregiving for kids different from caregiving for older persons? I'm not sure I know, but that's a question that I'd wanted to pose to you in this particular section. What I'm going to speak to you next about is workplace sexual harassment. I don't know if you managed to get access to the videos, but there's a really powerful video that I wanted to play here. Yes. Oh, this should be on YouTube. Do you mind looking it up?
So what happened was that I was sexually harassed in my workplace. So what happened was...
So I've asked for this to be paused really quickly because I do want to say that this video could potentially be triggering for some of you. It does talk about sexual harassment. So if you need to step out, please do. I also have the number of Aware Sexual Assault Care Center on my slide in case you want to talk to a counselor after watching this video. The number is 677-90282. Trigger warning, content warning for sexual harassment. Please go ahead.
Was that I was sexually harassed in my workplace on several occasions. If somebody asks you out on a date, and it's very clearly a date, but they are a fair few years your superior in job position, in job title, and the fact that who they are makes you feel uncomfortable about saying no, I didn't realize that that could constitute harassment when done in the context of the workplace. And I don't think I realized that persistence when I said no also constituted harassment. And many people might think that that's not serious. People comment on your body. People comment on your face. People ask you to come to client meetings because the client thinks you're pretty. There's a lot of things that get said about you to your face that you are massively uncomfortable with. There was a very strong anti-sexual harassment policy in place. And they said, we do not care. I didn't know that I could go to the police. Didn't even cross my mind before. People are finally taking, specifically workplace behavior, much more seriously. And they're realizing that it does happen. And it happens so much more than people realize. To organizations, listen. Listen when people come to you and they tell you that something has happened to them. Take them seriously. I think there is a fundamental issue with having documents within a workplace that say, this is our anti-sexual harassment policy. The problem being that you need people to put that into action. You need people to be able to say, this policy has teeth. But without people who have the power to implement these policies, nothing is going to change. To colleagues, if somebody comes to you, somebody who works with you comes to you and says, something bad has happened to me in the workplace. I've been sexually harassed in the workplace. Listen, realize that for them, the workplace has suddenly become a very difficult, very traumatizing environment that they have to be in. Because you're tied there, whether you like it or not. If you have the chance, if you have the opportunity to be there for somebody, be there. You can really change someone's life.
So I wanted to do this with every workplace issue that we discussed today. I had a video that I wanted to play for you. And one set of questions that I wanted to ask you after each video was, what does the video make you feel? Any reactions to watching this? And to give you some context, we produced this video after Me Too. This was the first time, so this is a much shorter version of the longer video that we produced. It was the first time that 10 victims, survivors of sexual harassment came forward, faced the camera, and spoke about their experiences. And the longer video has survivors of child sexual abuse, has survivors of date rape, but I wanted to particularly show you this particular segment on workplace sexual harassment because we're talking about workplace issues. Any reactions? Yes, please. Sorry? Asking someone out at the workplace is harassment. Would somebody like to respond to that? Yes, please.
I guess asking someone out is not necessarily something that could be considered sexual harassment, but if the person is saying no during different instances, then that is sexual harassment.
Also not in the workplace.
What do you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, but asking someone out in the workplace and getting no as an answer, it's not necessarily harassment.
Yeah, but in this case, we're talking probably about something that happened like different times, at different moments. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she said that the guy insisted that I didn't hear any like harassment in the sense that he was saying, hey, you need to go out with me because I'm your superior and unless you're going to have consequences, and that's much more harassment than asking someone out a couple of times and getting no as an answer. I think that
even if the person who's asking you out is your boss, your supervisor?
Yeah, and if I'm not interested, I can say no, and that's not harassment, that's normal human relationships.
Right. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, but I think about that, like when a superior asks to a woman on a date, if she says no, so most of the time I think it will put consequence on her, like, I don't know, maybe giving less job or being way more gentle with her, so the consequence to this negative answer is actually the harassment. So that's why we're talking about that, I think. Yeah, but like when your superior asks you to a date, you know, like sometimes if you say no, you will have to face consequence. So it's really hard to say no, I think. Yeah, like, I don't know, like, it's complicated, but yeah.
I mean, attraction is natural, right? But the impulse to act on that attraction is, I think, what we're talking about here. Whether or not this is appropriate workplace behavior. Yes?
I have something to say about that because like the working place is a really complex environment. So there's rumors, there's a lot of things talking about you. So when you like superior box something like they have power, oppression on you, the working place can be very suffocating for someone. So the environment itself or this kind of action is like we need to create an environment that like make employees feel free to live with. It's not something that the action itself constitutes as harassment. Like people's rumors, people's ideas can be harassment. And that's my ideas about this job because we are so used to like some hidden, we are so used to like not react something. And that's the video tells us like somebody comes to you, you need to pay attention or you need to take it serious. And that's really inspiring for me, I guess.
Thank you. That's a great point. In fact, there are two really good points that you made there. One, that women should have the right to a safe working place, right? As much as men. And that's just a fundamental human right. You should be able to work in an office free of harassment. If not, again, that can have serious consequences for your career. A forthcoming research from AWARE actually shows, and this is a national survey of 1,000 Singaporeans and peers we conducted late last year, that 1 in 10 people who have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace go on to quit their jobs. A separate study also shows that workplace sexual harassment has an impact on your productivity. It decreases productivity, it increases absenteeism, and yes, it does make you want to quit the job that you're doing. Because why would you want to go to a workplace where you're being harassed, sexually or otherwise? Any other comments, questions? Yes?
I personally somewhat agree with Filippo. Like, I feel like it's very hard to make everything black and white. There's a lot of gray area in like human relations. So personally, I feel it's okay, like if people are asking each other and like there are yeses and nos, but the fact that there's a committee or a person who's actually taking action about the policies would be like, to make that committee stronger would be a better I would say situation than people stepping back from actually building relationships.
But does it have to be an either or? I think this conversation is really valuable because what is it doing? It's giving us information about our cultural practices, what we think is acceptable behavior, what we think is not acceptable behavior. And workplaces need to have standards that are shared by everybody. We are all increasingly working in multicultural environments, right? Interacting with people where certain kinds of behaviors may be acceptable in their cultures, but are a complete no-no in some other cultures, right? And these conversations really help because they bring everybody to the same page so that you understand what the workplace culture is, not just the culture of that one person, right? Or 2 people or 3 people. What is the workplace culture? Employers have to set the tone. They have to, and you're absolutely right. I mean, committees are really important and they should be given more power to investigate. But what will they investigate if it's not obvious what is acceptable behavior and what is not? And unless you have these standards in place, an employee can always defend themselves and say, I didn't know this was not acceptable. It's totally fine for me to do this at home. I had no idea. Which is why policies are so important. Policies on sexual harassment are so important. And it's important that these policies clearly define what sexual harassment is. And let's remember one thing. When we talk about sexual harassment, it's not the intention of the harasser that matters. It's the effect that it has on the victim, on the survivor. And of course, there's a test of reasonableness here, right? Even when you're evaluating whether or not a particular behavior constituted harassment, you are relying on the effect it had on the victim, but you're also thinking about whether or not a reasonable person in that victim's position would react the same way or not. So there is a test of reasonableness. It's not completely subjective. Yes?
Hi. I was thinking about what everybody said and what you were saying before, and I wanted to ask, keeping in mind the arguments that you brought today here, what is your solution to these harassments that happen? Because in my mind, if you will write down a law saying that relationships in the workplace are illegal, it will make the workplace even more uncomfortable than it is now, and will have the same consequences that you mentioned before. So encouraging people to leave their job because they cannot have relationships with people that they meet at their job, and a series of other consequences. Because, for example, I was working at a company before coming here, huge multinationals, and my VP was dating, and everybody knew it, program manager of my team. And they were working extremely fine together. They had no problems at all, and there wasn't any harassment involved. But following the argument of the girl, when my VP would have asked her out in the first place, she could have gone to like the women rights advocacy of Amazon and reported the case and kicked him out of the job. But that would have been a destructive solution for the workplace as much as the possibility of harassment that didn't happen.
So just to summarize, you're saying that if employers were to disallow employees from having romantic or sexual relationships with each other, that would have the same labor outcomes as women experiencing harassment in the workplace.
Not necessarily the same, but as destructive.
Right, but similar consequences.
You could say that.
Right. Any responses? Yes.
Maybe to add to, because it's on the same subject, because last year the McDonald's CEO was fired because he had a relationship which was said to be consensual with an employee, and he was fired because he had violated company policy and shown poor judgment. Do you think that this is maybe bringing the red line a bit too far, or do you think this is maybe the right way to place the red line in order to prevent other cases which might go in some other ways, or do you think this is maybe pushing it too far?
Yes, the McDonald's case is a little tricky, right? Because he was the CEO, obviously has a lot of power, a lot of individual power to make decisions. McDonald's is also a private company, and they can make policies that they want. They have to comply with the law of the land, but they can always go beyond what the laws require. And this is why I can't think of a single country that has a specific law on romantic and sexual relationships at the workplace being banned. Can you? No, I'm talking to Xavier.
I don't.
No, right? I mean, I can't think of a single country that has specific laws that ban romantic or sexual relationships in the workplace. But
US? US, I don't know.
No, I don't think it has a specific law. I mean, there are anti-harassment policies, but anti-harassment policies typically don't cover these kinds of situations, right? Yeah. So it's tough to say without knowing more details whether or not this particular case crossed the red line. But what you say about the behavior of the company leader, sort of setting the culture and the tone for the organization, is absolutely right? Which is why we often hold leaders, managers to a higher standard, especially when it comes to behaviors of the nature that you're describing. I only have about 2 minutes left. I want to quickly share with you some data. So, yes, did you want to respond?
Very quickly, because we have to conclude. Filippo, you want? Sure.
Okay. I can leave my email with Xavier, and we can follow this up with an email conversation. So this is Singapore Police Force data. Between 2017 and 2019, there were about 619 cases of workplace sexual harassment between employees. These are just reported cases. The thing to remember about workplace sexual harassment is that, as with any other form of sexual harassment, it is wildly underreported. If we were to look at data from our sexual assault care center, I can tell you that out of every 10 clients we see, 7 do not go on to make official reports. 7 do not go on to make official reports. So each time you look at official data on workplace sexual harassment, please take it with a pinch of salt. And underreporting is so prevalent because women are afraid that they're not going to be believed when they speak up. And there are a number of examples across the world to illustrate this. They're also afraid that they're going to be retaliated against. And we spoke about this a little bit, right? That if your boss is asking you out, you say no, there can be consequences in terms of the work that you're assigned, whether or not you get the next promotion or not. There's also a fair amount of self-blame. You may believe that you're responsible for your own victimization, and you don't come forward because of that. There are a number of other reasons why women don't come forward and report to official authorities. And many times they don't even tell their friends and family that they have been sexually harassed. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, there are specific kinds of cumulative labor effects, both career as well as financial, that workplace sexual harassment has on women. We found in a qualitative research that we conducted with 39 survivors of workplace sexual harassment, and this is also another forthcoming research from AWARE, that workplace sexual harassment changed the direction of some women's careers. They decided to quit the industry they were in to join a pink industry where there are more women than men, thinking that that industry is going to keep them safe, that the chances of workplace sexual harassment are not going to be as high as the industry they were already working with. This obviously contributes to the gender pay gap as well, because if you're going to step out of the labor force to heal from the trauma of sexual harassment, you're going to lose out a couple of years of work experience, which will then show up in the income that you subsequently make, because most jobs are indexed to the money that you made previously. In terms of what we recommend a specific legislation on workplace sexual harassment. We also think that employers should be legally liable for preventing sexual harassment from taking place. That they should have policies, that they should have compulsory trainings, and these trainings should be provided pretty frequently so that everybody is on the same page about what constitutes sexual harassment and what remedies are available. Finally, I had started this presentation talking about intersectional feminism, social justice principles, and I wanted to leave you with something slightly different, which is the business case for addressing these issues. Now, addressing work-care conflict, addressing gender diversity on boards, and of course, workplace sexual harassment actually improves national productivity and economic growth. So even if you don't want to do it for the right reasons, do it for business-related reasons, right? Even if you don't think there should be women on boards, that there should be 30% women on boards, there is plenty of evidence, there's plenty of research available that shows that companies perform better, they have a better reputation, they make productivity gains when they have more women on boards, when they address the specific needs of working caregivers, when they address workplace sexual harassment. So that's something that I want you to keep in mind. And finally, I don't know where my clicker is, it's here, sorry. I know I've sort of spent a lot of time yapping, and we've hopefully had an interesting discussion on gender-related issues, but many of you might be thinking what you can do, what you can specifically do as students, employees of the future, employers of the future. These are just some ideas. I'm sure you can come up with other ideas. You're going to spend the entire week sort of thinking of something innovative. You can and should insist on blind recruitment, especially if you're an employer and you have the power to set policies. Ask your company to declare gender pay gap information. That's something that we discussed as well, that can have positive consequences for gender pay gap. You should insist that your employers provide workplace harassment trainings. You should ask them questions about whether or not the workplace has a policy on workplace harassment, when the next training is going to be. It's important that you take that self-advocacy role in workplaces. And finally, if you are an employer yourself and you have the ability to set policies, think about offering flexible work arrangements. We didn't get to talk about this, but one recommendation that AWARE makes is that employees should have the right to request flexible work arrangements, much like in the UK. So it should not be up to managers to make subjective decisions about who deserves to be on a flexible work arrangement and who doesn't. This should be available to everybody, not just mothers, not just caregivers. And of course, think about treating those with caregiving responsibilities of older persons on par with those who are caring for young children. I'm going to leave you all with this slide. If at all you're interested in the work that AWARE does, please consider volunteering with us. And if you have any feedback for me, please use the QR code on the right to send me your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.